Thank you so much, and thank you all for coming to what I hope will be a very interesting and spirited conversation. For those of you expecting a debate, you will not get it because this is Bret's evening, and I'm going to try and facilitate the exposure, your exposure to the brilliance and wit of Bret Stephens. There will be perhaps some points of discord, so I want to be clear right from the start that Bret is a good friend and somebody who I admire tremendously. Having said that, Bret, you've written this fascinating book and wonderfully written and really a very good Hanukkah present. And for the other 10%, you can give it for Christmas too. But you've also written a pretty spirited column today in the Wall Street Journal. I think it's titled "Why I Do Not Apologize for Waterboarding," or something like that. I think I have it right. And so I wanted to start with something, that's in the news that people might be thinking about. And the question I guess I have reading that column, and I think the title is a very good title in that it tells you exactly what the column is about. I wondered, conservatives are always very suspicious, often justifiably so, of bureaucracies, government bureaucracies. They think they're inefficient, dysfunctional, make mistakes, sloppy, try to cover them up, waste money, except for some bureaucracies. Because when the CIA tells you, trust us, in the years after 9/11, in the months after 9/11, when we had to go from 0 to 60 and ramp up, interrogate all these people, we did a great job. It worked well, it was just exactly right, we didn't cross the line, we got information that was useful. Yeah, there were those 2 psychologists we plucked out of a hat and gave $82 million to, but trust us, that was all, it worked really well. And then comes the Senate report, which has 6,000 pages of documentation of perhaps an alternative view. Why is this one government bureaucracy you think got it right?
I don't think it got it right. I think it would be absurd to make the argument that every government agency or any government agency has a perfect track record of success. I think it's equally absurd to make the argument that dozens, scores, hundreds of Americans who were earnestly involved in an effort in the immediate aftermath of the most catastrophic attack on the United States in its history were engaged in a widespread attempt to not only, or widespread kind of conspiracy-like attempt to gratuitously harm our enemies for the sake of goals that they then went to great lengths to cover up. So part of being a conservative is resisting the urge for conspiracy thinking, and I think, by the way, that's particularly true today when a wing of the conservative party is so suspicious of government that it thinks that it can do absolutely nothing right. There are 2 interesting journalistic events, or several interesting journalistic events that have just transpired. One of them is a story, an extraordinarily compelling and horrifying story, published in a magazine about a terrible rape that occurred or was alleged to have occurred at the University of Virginia. And dozens of reputable journalists looked at this story and said, oh my goodness, this is so awful. And it fits so neatly with a pre-existing narrative that they had, which was that college campuses in America were hotbeds of sexually abusive behavior toward young women. And this story was widely believed. I happen to be one of the people who didn't believe it and wrote about it before the story came apart. We have to be very careful about stories, whether they are government reports or articles in magazine articles that make sensational allegations without interviewing key witnesses. And one of the things that I find deeply disconcerting about the Feinstein report is that not one, not 2, but every single major CIA director and deputy director and all of the people who are most closely aligned with the interrogation program were never interviewed for it. So having emails at copious lengths making sensational allegations does not prove a case. I'm sorry, but I've just been immersed in this Netflix series on Kublai Khan, so my mind has been obsessed with this, but there's some monk character who offers what I gather is a Chinese proverb which says, off by an inch, off by a mile. I don't know if that's an ancient Chinese proverb or something that writers at Netflix came up with. But if this report is off by an inch, it's also off by a mile. And mind you, I had a colleague, Daniel Pearl, who was beheaded by Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. I am not sorry that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, for Danny Pearl alone, went through what he went through. And I am not sorry that CIA officers in dark days after 9/11 took every step and pushed the edge of the law to make sure it would not happen again. Bureaucracies either go too far or they're too cautious. That's just the nature of any bureaucratic enterprise. And if the allegation is this bureaucracy went too far, well, it may also be said that senators like Dianne Feinstein and Jay Rockefeller and House Majority Leader, then Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi, were fully briefed, as they ought to admit, on exactly what was being done.
And do you think that the nature of terror, when we look at it today, if you look at what has happened recently in Sydney, if you look at what happened in Toronto, if you look at what has happened in Europe over the last few years, or right, what strikes me about the kind of terrorism we're up against, in part because governments are now much more attentive to these movements, is you've got lone groups, lone wolves as they call them, often self-radicalized. Sometimes they act in cahoots with one or two people. In many cases, essentially psychopaths who have been searching for some ideology of violence and have found it. In other cases, people who have genuinely, converted to it over the internet or in some way or the other. Think of the Boston bombers. If that is the nature of the kind of threat we face, is the massive amount of attention paid to this kind of enhanced interrogation techniques, Guantanamo, black sites, it all feels like we're sort of trying to fight an enemy that is actually much less the pressing problem than the one we have today. That if you were trying to say to yourself, how would you prevent the events that I've just described, which is the vast majority of terrorism that's taken place in the West in the last few years, you'd say, well, you need good local intelligence, which means you need to understand and penetrate these communities, have local allies who will tell you about troublesome radical members. You need to have very good special ops, the kind the Australians seem to have, do pretty well. You need resilience, the ability to bounce back from these things, which are kind of a different set of techniques than, invade a country, set up black sites, throw hundreds of people into Guantanamo, and push them to the edge of interrogation.
Right. Well, you need a variety of things, and one of the things that's most worrying to me is, all of the things that you described are essential. But one thing that it does concern me is that in the last 5 or 6 years, our global problem with, and it is a worldwide problem, and ultimately the greatest victims today of terror are typically Muslims. You saw it in the mind-numbing attack on the school in northwestern Pakistan. But one of the things that's very striking is that in the last 5 years, as we have downplayed the utility of military and intelligence responses to terror and tried to talk up the importance of cooperative relationships with neighbors and other tools of American power, our terrorism problem has in fact become much worse. There was a Rand Corporation study that, and I'm just citing it because it's as authoritative as I think they come, that suggests that between 2010 and 2009 and 13, I think it was 2009 and 2013, the number of independent jihadist groups grew by something like 58%. The number of jihadist fighters is estimated to have doubled, and that study appeared before ISIS took control of Mosul. So clearly something is not working and is not being done in terms of our efforts to deal with this one source of global disorder. My book describes many of them, and terrorism, the Sunni or Islamist terrorism is not the only one, and perhaps not even the most significant one. But the problem is actually becoming worse as I argue, the Obama administration has put America into a retrenchment mode, has been relatively shy. I know there are important and noteworthy and laudable exceptions, but relatively shy about applying hard power, and has created power vacuums around the world that have been exploited by people we don't like. It is, you know, we thought we had achieved a success in Pakistan because we talked about core al-Qaeda being on the path to defeat. What we neglected to note was that other franchises of al-Qaeda or al-Qaeda plus, whatever you want to call ISIS, were not only growing, they were metastasizing. So there is a price to this retrenchment or this retreat, which is you are creating power vacuums, and vacuums want to be filled.
So if the Obama administration's, and now we are into the heart of the book really, if the Obama administration's, I keep mentioning the book because I want you to remember there's an actionable item you can deal with at the end of the.
Hold on, let's do this.
Yeah. If the Obama administration has been reluctant to use hard power, and that has produced or exacerbated a terrorism problem, let me ask you this. The Bush administration showed no such reluctance. It invaded 2 countries right after 9/11. The invasion of Iraq, of course, dislodged Saddam Hussein, dismantled the army, created a massive power vacuum, which over time has been filled by an al-Qaeda presence in Iraq, which never existed, which then morphed into the Islamic State, which then crossed borders into Syria as a power vacuum developed there. Was the Bush administration's application of hard power, did the Bush administration's application of hard power reduce the number of terrorists in the Middle East or increase them?
Well, obviously that's a difficult question to answer and a very interesting question to explore. Look, this book is not at all soft on the Bush administration, and it is very critical of probably of some of the things you actually liked about the Bush administration, because you're more of a fan of Bush in his second term, or at least part of his second term than I am. But look, we went, or ought to have gone. Let me step back a second. Some of you probably remember this memorable interview with Sarah Palin and Charlie Gibson when she had just been named for the VP slot. And Charlie Gibson said to her, "What do you think of the Bush Doctrine?" And she said, "In what respect?" And there was this moment where you were left to wonder, was she just stalling for time, or was this actually a plausible question? Well, I don't know the answer to that, but it is not a bad question, because there was Bush 1.0. In the wake of 9/11, Bush said, "We will not allow the world's worst regimes to get the world's most terrible weapons." And that was the rationale with which we marched into Iraq, certainly, and also to some extent to Afghanistan. I am broadly sympathetic with that view. This is a foreign policy that's essentially about keeping our nightmares at bay. And I think that ultimately when you construct a foreign policy, a feasible foreign policy, that's what you ought to do. You ought to think of what are the 5 things that as a great power we must not allow to happen, and then think, well, how do we go about trying to make sure they don't happen? And all the rest of it essentially is gravy. If good things happen, then that's terrific. But then we go into Iraq and we discover, or we think we discover, that we haven't found weapons of mass destruction there. In fact, we did find a weapon of mass destruction in Iraq that was responsible for the death of about 100,000 people a year, and its name was Saddam Hussein. But that's another story. But we go into Iraq, and suddenly this very secondary rationale for the war, the so-called freedom agenda, is pushed up to the front and becomes the primary rationale for the war. Okay, so we didn't find WMD, but nonetheless, our real task in this region is to create the conditions for a liberal democratic state that is going to be a shining city on an Arab hill for the rest of the region to follow. And we are going to try to turn Iraq into a model Arab democracy, because as we know, democracies don't go to war, et cetera, et cetera. So we went in with an effort to make an example of Saddam Hussein, and then we ended up staying in an effort to make Iraq exemplary. And this is, in my view, the essence of the fiasco in Iraq. We were pursuing a kind of utopian soft power goal. Whereas what we really had an interest in doing is making an example of Saddam, hoping in the likeliest world to find a Mubarak-like figure, and then having a kind of a security concordat where we could have a troop presence in Iraq to prevent the kind of descent into chaos that we have seen today. Instead, we went from being Mr. Big into becoming Mr. Busybody. And that was a disastrous policy. This argument will never be resolved, and there will be historians 100 years from now having this argument, I imagine. But that is the problem that we had in Iraq.
And yet, it seems to me you want to replicate that or try it again in Syria. Because in Syria, it feels to me you have a situation very similar to Iraq. Syria is the third of the great minority regimes in the Middle East that are being displaced by a kind of rise of the majority. The first was Lebanon in the 1970s, 15-year civil war, 1 out of every 20 Lebanese died. They came to a shaky, fragile peace. The second was Iraq. We very kindly displaced the minority regime, the Sunnis, but they fought back in an insurgency. They're still fighting back today. Syria is the third, an Alawite regime, actually the smallest of the minorities, 14% of the country, and now you have this great Sunni revolt against it. There are, by the Director of National Intelligence, the intelligence people whom you just praised a minute ago, 1,500 separate militias in Syria. Most of the most powerful ones of them are ISIS. The others are al-Nusra, which is an al-Qaeda affiliate. The Assad regime obviously has a very powerful army. We've found about 100 of those that are not Assad and not al-Qaeda and not ISIS, and we call them the Free Syrian Army. So my question to you is, do you really feel that we can be Mr. Busybody in Syria, which is to say, in the midst of this chaos that is taking place, figure out who the good guys are, support them, ensure that they'll win, and trust that when they win, they'll set up a nice pluralistic democracy and won't, in fact, avenge havoc on Syria just the other way around. In fact, slaughtering the Alawites instead of the Sunnis being slaughtered.
No, not for a second do I think that. We are not, it would be pure utopianism to imagine that we are going to set up a multi-confessional, multi-sectarian, multi-ethnic state in Syria. But look at what the consequences of complete inaction, or effectively complete inaction, have been. We went from, in the first few months of the Arab Spring, a largely peaceful and very honorable revolt against this despotic Assad regime that didn't become militarized really throughout most of 2011. We did nothing. Then in the subsequent year, things became much, much worse, and something like a relatively effective Free Syrian Army stood up. These are not like my best Zionist friends, obviously. They were typically led by disaffected former generals in the regime, but it was still a plausible force that we could have supported in some major way. Again, we did nothing, thinking, in fact, that Assad was going to fall on his own weight. You'll remember at some point the Obama administration said that the regime's days were numbered. Now we're in a state where there are 200,000 people cruelly dead. Syria could hardly be in a worse situation. The worst people on either side of the divide are victorious. ISIS on the Sunni side, Hezbollah and the Assad people on the government side, supported by Iran. The chaos has infected now Iraq in a very big way and threatens to topple a stable, allied, moderate regime in Jordan. Lebanon is under tremendous pressure. Israel just, according to foreign sources, bombed further sites inside of Syria. So the point I'm making, I guess, is Syria is a poor test case for, or rather I should say an excellent example of the consequences of inaction by American policy. Now, what are the sorts of actions are there actions that you might have taken, that we might have taken, to prevent this complete Hobbesian war of all against all and worst against worst? Well, again, it's a bit of a moot court situation because we will never know. But I suspect that if we had intervened early on the side, if we had made it clear that we were prepared to help to push out Assad early on, we could have had a palace coup that would have led to a reasonable result and a political result. I suspect that at a minimum, if in September or August of 2013, after Assad had flouted President Obama's red line, if we had targeted Assad and punished him directly, at a minimum, even if we hadn't solved Syria, we would have demonstrated to other similar like-minded dictators that there are consequences to certain forms of behavior. That wouldn't have put the Humpty Dumpty of Syria back together, but it wouldn't have led to the follow-on catastrophe of a collapse in American presidential credibility, which I think helps explain why the U.S. is where it is in terms of foreign policy today.
So where is the U.S. in foreign policy today, or in the world today? Because when I look out at the world, yeah, the Middle East is unstable, as it has been for the last 40 years. And yet, despite all the things you described, the astonishing fact is that the single index of price of stability in the Middle East, or instability, the price of oil, is down 40%. If you look around the world, what is striking is Europe is growing at 0, Japan is growing at 0, the United States grew last quarter at 4%. It's quite possible to make the argument that by husbanding power, by reforming, by first of all tackling the economic crisis better than any of the advanced industrial countries, the Obama administration has managed to achieve a pretty unusual position in the world today. The United States is strong, the dollar is strong, the American economy is strong. The New York Times had a story pointing out that median wages are rising for the first time in 20 years. And it has not found itself bound up in a foreign adventure which would inevitably be an enormous drain on the time, energy, and attention of the United States. Yeah, there are bad things happening in the world, and there are bad things happening in Syria, but would the United States have done what you're describing? I think one could make one confident prediction. Whatever happened, it wouldn't quite go as planned, and the United States would be in the middle of it. As I've sometimes tried to convince my friends in Pakistan who are very intent on maintaining control or influence in Afghanistan, they don't seem to understand. This is sort of a 19th century game. First prize, you get Afghanistan for 5 years. Second prize, you get it for 10 years. Right? The idea should be to have not as little to do as Afghanistan as you want. So when you look at the United States, you know, compared to the end of the Bush years, with this vigorous application of American power, when 85% of Germans thought the United States was the most dangerous country in the world, I don't know, it doesn't look so bad to me.
Well, you know, I never thought I would say this, but I think you're too parochially American, Fareed. And you know, I mean, I'm sure you've had this experience many times. This is my first rodeo, as they say. It's my first book. And one of the things you do on a book tour is you do radio interviews, and you do them almost incessantly, which is a bit of a whipsawing experience when you go from the NPR affiliate in Burlington, Vermont, to right-wing radio in Lubbock, Texas, and you try to modulate your tone. But the comment I keep getting is, so the rest of the world is in real trouble, and what's it to me? So what? And my answer is, look in your pocket and pull out the phone. I bet it's a Samsung phone. It's the most popular phone in the world. What does it mean that our prosperity is in fact intimately tied up with the prosperity of countries that are very far and very distant from us? Now, we think I'm using South Korea as an example because we think, well, South Korea is a 21st century, first world, capitalist Asian democracy. But 63 years ago, when we embarked on another dubious adventure in trying to save the periphery from our enemies, The GDP per capita of South Korea was less than the GDP per capita of what was then the Belgian Congo, later Zaire, and then the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And that's to say that people make the point that American strength at home is essential for American strength abroad. That's very true. But strength abroad is also essential for strength at home. We live in one world economy. It worries me deeply that Europe has had next to no economic growth for decades. It should worry us profoundly that Japan is in this extended slump. Why is that? Well, in the case of Japan, for example, I think the Chinese are getting the idea that now that their economy, at least nominally, has surpassed the Japanese economy in raw GDP, that they can start bullying the Japanese in ways that they wouldn't have dreamed of doing 10, 15, 20 years ago. All of a sudden, many of you have heard of these little islands, the Senkaku Islands, these little rocks in the sea. China suddenly imposed an air defense identification zone. It worries me also that the periphery of Europe now seems to be fatally exposed to a rampaging Russian dictator who is not being held back by falling oil prices and a declining economic situation, but to some extent he's being emboldened by it. We forget, democracies, when we deal with economic contractions, we become more risk averse. Dictatorships, when they have economic contractions, they become more risk prone. Just think of Argentina in the wake of the Falklands mess. The broadest point is this: we live in one free world, one world economy. It is in our interest to make sure that the French, the Poles, the Estonians, the Japanese, the Taiwanese are growing and prosperous and play by a set of common rules. I think it's wrong to say, well, we're doing well, and the Japanese are doing poorly, and, well, tough luck to them, and I'm glad that we're not over there. Our oceans are not moats, and that's what worries me about some thinking emerging today.
So if you look at the world you're describing, the truth of the matter is, just as a matter of fact, the United States is actually surprisingly insulated from the rest of the world. Imports make up 14% of the US economy. They make up 45 to 50% of the German economy, 30% of the Chinese economy, and that's unusual because China mostly exports. But the US, the North American continent, is this amazing self-contained juggernaut. And now you have this extraordinary transformation because of shale and tight oil, where the centers of economic activity in the world have been disconnected from the centers of energy production. It was the case that you worried about what happened in the Middle East because that was the vital lifeline, the lifeblood of the industrialized world. And that's changed. So I do think that some of these things have changed, but I take your point that Europe's slump is deeply worrying, Japan's slump is deeply worrying, but I'm not sure that invading Syria is going to solve either of those.
No, but I wouldn't want to invade Syria.
But I want to ask you, in Asia in particular, where you pointed out that there is a certain kind of geopolitical tension, the Obama administration has made its one area of very active and assertive diplomacy has been a pivot to Asia. They have strengthened military relations with the Philippines and reopened a base there, which had been closed because during the end of the Cold War. They have opened a sort of small base in Australia and reaffirmed and strengthened military relations there. They have made very clear that the U.S. self-defense treaty with Japan actually involves and includes those islands, which is a deterrent, I think, to China. So it does feel like in the one area of the world where your critique is absolutely true, which is that were there to be geopolitical tension in Asia, a core part of the global economic system would be threatened. The Obama administration is trying to put in place a kind of vigorous and sustained use of American power. Do you agree with it, or do you feel it's too little?
Well, I agree with it. Let me make a few points. First of all, I do not believe we should invade Syria. Okay, just to clarify.
The use of military power against a sovereign country is generally called invasion.
We bomb.
Now you can call it what you will. We can call these things enhanced interrogation techniques and military operations, but you're an elegant and clear writer, so I thought we'd use the shortest word, Occam's razor.
Well, look, Ronald Reagan did not invade Libya in 1986. He conducted a police action against Libya in 1986. I would be the last one to argue for the case for sending the 3rd Infantry Division or any infantry division up into Damascus. It would be utter folly. On the other hand, when the President of the United States repeatedly sets a red line against the use of chemical weapons and then effectively finds a contrivance to get out of making good on his word simply by targeting Assad's air forces, which are now substituting chlorine gas for sarin gas in order to slaughter the Syrian people, I don't think that's an invasion. I think that's a prudent use of force and an effort to insist that American threats as well as promises are credible. One of the arguments that I make in the book is that America should be the world's policeman, not the world's priest. We went into Iraq and we became its priest. We were trying to heal a crippled society. We were trying to change or win hearts and minds, a notably poor strategy from the days of Vietnam onwards. The role of a policeman is simply to enforce certain modes of behavior. And above all, the role of a policeman, as we learned over the course of the last 20 years, isn't so much to react to instances of disorder, although that is an important component of it. It is actually to create a sense of order. It is to give the assurance to that little lady coming down from her apartment building who wants to walk across the street to the bodega and do her shopping, that there's a cop right there, and he's looking after her. And if those kind of thuggish teenagers are going to start, giving her a hard time, he's going to make sure they go away. And analogously, and I know the analogy is not perfect, but analogously, that should be the role of the United States. Our first responsibility.
Everywhere in the world.
What?
Everywhere in the world.
No, I'll get to that in 1 second. Our first responsibility should be to assure our friends, and particularly our little friends, that our security guarantees are good, that we really are looking out for them, that if Estonia joins NATO, it means that our word is as good in a little country of 2 million people on the Baltic Sea as it is for, say, the English or the French or somewhere else. And one of the things that I find worrying is to hear too many people, the Poles, the Saudis, the Israelis, the Taiwanese, typically privately, although sometimes this explodes into public, especially if it's an Israeli defense minister venting, expressing real concern about the quality of our guarantees. Now, I am for the Obama administration, I think, actually has conducted itself, at least in certain respects, very well in Asia. The signals that Chuck Hagel, who I didn't typically praise, sent by sending 2 B-52 bombers right through that air defense identification zone were the right signals. The efforts to restore military ties to the Philippines are the right signals. On the other hand, we promised a pivot to Asia in 2010, and for the most part, that pivot has been a feint. There's very little actual military power going to Asia, in part because we are cutting our military in ways that are unprecedented. I guess the only precedent would be the post-Cold War peace dividend. So our ability to defend our allies is simply not what it used to be. The bigger problem, I think, with the Obama view is the very term pivot. We don't have responsibilities that are merely geographic. We have global responsibilities. We ought to have priorities. Priorities are different from pivots, and we said, okay, the future is going to be in Asia, and in 2011 or 12, that was a reasonable thing to say. Yeah, the future is in Asia. And Europe, who could imagine war in Europe? Well, sure enough, now you do imagine it. Now you do witness it. Thousands of people in eastern Ukraine are being killed in ways that, as our Secretary of State said, is just 19th century behavior. Well, the 19th century is coming back in a big way. So we have to figure out what are those nodes, those places where where our guarantees have to be good, our commitments have to be credible. What are the geopolitical fires that we think this is going to burn down the whole neighborhood? Let's not allow it to spread. And what are the geopolitical fires that we're going to say it's tragic, but it's probably going to burn itself out? And to some extent, I think maybe one of the arguments we're having here implicitly is you would probably say Syria, it's tragic. You don't want to walk into that conflagration. You're just going to get burned. My argument is it's going to burn down the whole neighborhood in a way that's going to hurt us. But say South Sudan. South Sudan is tragic. It's heartbreaking. I don't see American interests being critically affected in South Sudan. So it's the act of statesmanship to figure out where you have to focus. And by the way, let me praise Clinton at the expense of the first President Bush. President Clinton realized that he had to intervene in the Balkans in the way that the first President Bush refused to do. And guess what? Here you had a state that emerged from the ashes of World War I. It was a make-believe state of many religions, Muslims, Christians, Orthodox, Catholics, many languages, and yet prudent, limited, but cleverly deployed American intervention made it possible for the Balkans to split up responsibly, ended the slaughter of tens of thousands of people, ended the regime of Slobodan Milosevic. I was just in Belgrade not so long ago. It's an emerging democracy, and kept that war from igniting another fire in Europe. Not bad, President Clinton.
So you've mentioned Russia and Ukraine a number of times. So let me ask you the question this way. When you look at what has happened in retrospect now, one could make the case that what President Obama did has worked. That is to say, the Russians essentially invaded Ukraine and lopped off Crimea and have essentially ensured that eastern Ukraine be run by the pro-Russian forces there, who do seem to have something of a majority in that part of Ukraine. There was never a plausible military response. Russia is much closer to Ukraine, cares much more deeply about it, and the Russian defense budget is 21 times the Ukrainian defense budget. And so there was a danger felt even by Europeans that suggesting that there was a military option could embolden the Ukrainians to act in a rash way. That the only thing you could do was to punish the Russians and to extract a sort of price for it. And the only way that was going to work was to have the Europeans come on board, because the United States is a relatively small player. The Europeans are the big economic actors in Russia. And so they got the Europeans on board. The EU, which is very slow to act and cumbersome, actually enacted 2 rounds of sanctions, some of which are real. The US has enacted more. They have also used bank sanctions, which, as you know, can be very effective, and all of which clearly has had the effect of reducing the demand for Russian energy, which is one piece of the reason why the price of oil has fallen so dramatically. Obviously, there are much larger forces at work for any of these broad changes, but so you have a situation now where Putin is paying a price and Russia is paying a price for that. You pointed out earlier, it's not entirely clear how he will behave. I agree with that. I'm not sure I would agree with a simple rule that says democracies behave one way and dictatorships another. And I will quote as evidence for that. In Ruchir Sharma, who was just here, the head of Morgan Stanley's Emerging Markets book, he has a new foreword where he points out that he was at a conference, he was chairing a conference a year or two ago at which George W. Bush was there. And he asked Bush, why did you say when you met Putin for the first time that you looked into his eyes and you saw his soul and trusted him? And Bush had actually a very intelligent response. He said, well, remember when that was? I met him, he said, in early 2000. Russia had defaulted only 18 months earlier and was desperately trying to get the West to forgive its debts. Oil was at $25 a barrel, and the economy was still very weak and fragile. The last time I met Putin, he said, oil was at $120 a barrel, and Putin was lording it over me, telling me that Russia's sovereign wealth fund was full of this crappy American mortgage-based securities, and couldn't we run a better economy? We were destabilizing his hedge fund. And that does suggest, by the way, if you think through the logic of that, it does suggest that when Putin was weak economically, he was more diffident. When he was strong economically, he was more confident. And in fact, Russian expansionism over the last 10 years, think of Georgia, think of Moldova, has tended to actually go up as the price of oil went up. That has been the single sort of signal. All of which is to say, hasn't the Obama administration handled Russia pretty well?
No. Bush didn't handle Russia well, and by the way, came in largely with the same attitude that Obama did. Let's try to make a friend of this guy, and this guy turns out just doesn't want to be our friend. And both presidents had to learn that in their own time, in their own way. Look, in March of this year, Putin, just after the Olympics, simply seized Crimea, little green men cropped up out of nowhere. And we effectively did nothing. We sanctioned 7 individuals. Then, and by the way, I was looking back at some Russia hands who were experts on this subject in the immediate wake of the Crimean seizure, saying, well, Crimea, you have to understand, is very specially Russian. Putin has long had ties to this. There's the naval base at Sevastopol, all that history. And Crimea is really just overwhelmingly Russian. You kind of have to give him Crimea, right? I mean, come on. So the effort was, well, this is a fait accompli. We still have a lot of business to transact with the Russians in Syria and Iran and so on. Lo and behold, in 2 or 3 months, we were watching Russian, in a thinly disguised way, Russian militias beginning an armed insurrection in Luhansk and Donetsk on preposterous pretexts, having sham elections, claiming they were a people's republic, creating these rebellions, occasionally shooting down civilian airliners and killing 300-odd, mostly European or Australian citizens, Malaysians as well, and now then an armed invasion of eastern Ukraine. And I think the problem was that we sent a fatal signal too early that we were kind of prepared to let Crimea slide. We should have been much stronger at the beginning. Now, can I tell you for sure that this would have prevented?
Which means what? Send troops?
No, of course not. Of course not. You think that my idea of a solution to everything is send troops, all right?
I'm not sure what it means, because it always sounds like we should have huffed and puffed a little bit more.
No.
And I'm not sure what that would have done.
Well, we could have, look, in 1973, Richard Nixon, when Israel was faced with an emergency during the Yom Kippur War, sent plane loads of C-5s with everything that the Israelis needed in order to defend themselves militarily. And you know what? It wasn't bad, not only as a political signal, but also as military help. We knew from an early point that the Ukrainian military desperately needed certain kinds of basic things which we could easily provide them. I'm not talking about Apache helicopters and M1 tanks. I'm talking about night vision goggles, small drones for aerial reconnaissance, a whole series of Kevlar vests, light arms, anti-tank weapons, all kinds of things that could have helped the Ukrainians, as they nearly ended up succeeding in doing, putting down the rebellion in Ukraine. More importantly, but there are two...
Can I just stop you though?
Yeah.
Because I think it's important to play that out. They would never have been able to, because had they come close, the Russians would have sent more forces. And I say, the mismatch is so great. Egypt and Israel were essentially at parity in '73. Here you have a case where you could not win militarily, and so sending in American arms and putting America's reputation at stake, you would then have to face the problem. The Ukrainians would have lost. America would have been in there having supplied, aided, and assisted. Now what do? The Bret Stephens of the world would have said, America's credibility has been shattered, we have to escalate.
No. But,
would have said, oh, oops, I forgot Russia spends 20 times as much. Let's just quietly...
Well, what is the defense spending between Estonia and Russia?
Not very high, which is why I would say be very careful. If you're going to make a guarantee, make sure you can actually fulfill. Tom Schelling, the international relations professor of mine at Harvard, or he was teaching at Harvard when I was there, has this wonderful line in The Strategy of Conflict. He says, in international affairs, 2 things are very expensive: threats when they fail and promises when they succeed. So just be very careful about this.
No, and certainly we shouldn't have done it, but there were a couple of important equities at stake here. Number one was we had supported the so-called Maidan uprising, I think rightfully so, Ukrainians democratically standing up against a horrendous, not a horrendous, but a really kind of Bulgarian type of regime in Lukashenko, and we had supported it. Secondly, we had, in 1994, provided a memorandum to Ukraine called the Budapest Memorandum, signed by Yeltsin, Clinton, and John Major, the British Prime Minister at the time, saying that we would guarantee Ukrainian territorial sovereignty in exchange for Ukraine relinquishing its nuclear weapons, which was then the 3rd largest arsenal in the world. We got something from that because we wanted fewer countries to have nuclear weapons. But when it came time to making good on that guarantee, we were nowhere to be found, which alone is a worrying thing, because let's imagine you're some other country, okay, bula bula, all right? And you possess, or to use the mouse that roared, the Grand Duchy of Fenwick, and you possess some people in this audience get this reference, the mouse, the Peter Sellers movie, and you possess the Q bomb, and you're made to give it up in exchange for an American guarantee. The guarantee turns out to be worthless. Other countries take the cue. Other countries learn the lesson about the value of those guarantees. And maybe the next country which we would want to persuade to relinquish nuclear weapons, and a number of countries have peacefully relinquished their nuclear weapons, isn't going to take that bait, because they'll say, look, your guarantees for Ukraine were absolutely worthless. Second point is, well, maybe you're right, okay? Or maybe Putin would have said, you know what? Crimea is pretty good. And I'm not going to start an insurrection, at least not yet, in Luhansk and Donetsk. So there's a kind of a fatalist view to your argument that, yes, objectively, if Russia wants to seize Ukraine tomorrow, it will do so. We will not be able to stop it. But we need to start a way of imposing meaningful costs in a way that prevents or hopefully deters future adventurism, knowing full well, because we live in the world as it is, that you never have absolute certainty going forward that your gambits are going to work. That is the nature of politics.
I'm going to stop us for a second here just to ask. I know that there are questions from the audience, and somebody was going to hand me a bunch of questions, and I haven't gotten them. And to ask a question that's something of a digression. You've been so eloquent, Bret, and you've held the audience, I think, spellbound, except just 30 seconds ago, both your children walked out of the auditorium. And I want you to assure the audience that this is because it was their bedtime, and that not that they violently disagree with you and agree with me on the issue of reassurance and deterrence as it deals with Russia and Ukraine.
My wife and I, whose politics are not exactly matched, often wonder where the kids are going to go politically. And maybe now we have the answer.
Exactly. Thank you so much. Before we get to this, I thought I'd deal with, a country that may be of passing interest to this audience. So when I was in graduate school, we would study Israel's security. Israel's great worries were the great Iraqi army, the great Egyptian army, and the great Syrian army, which are essentially all destroyed, in shambles, no air force, nothing. Meanwhile, Israel has developed one of the world's most sophisticated armies, technologically probably right up there with the United States, maybe one half step below. It has a nuclear arsenal that is partly survivable even in the event of some catastrophic event. It's on submarines. It has managed to build a wall that has essentially solved the problem of Palestinian terror. It has built an iron dome that has largely defanged the threat of Hezbollah. Meanwhile, its enemies are all killing each other in Syria and Iraq. Why isn't it fair to say that Israel is more secure today than it's ever been in its history?
First of all, I don't applaud the enemies all killing each other. One of the things that we learned from the bitter experience of Iraq and Iran, it's always attributed to Kissinger. I don't know if it's fair, right. But may it go on forever, the Iran-Iraq war. But what we learned from the Iran-Iraq war is that the two countries came out in 1988 with an armistice, and within 18 months or so, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Iran began reconstituting itself, rebuilding itself in ways that were often quite aggressive. The bombings of the sites in Argentina happened just a few years later. It really upped its support for Hezbollah. The two countries did not emerge from an extended period of chaos exhausted and defanged in the way of France after the First World War. They emerged angry, defiant, revisionist, and scary. And they became security crises for the United States for decades up until the present day. So I don't see this kind of war of all against all in Syria as really a great plus for Israel. It's in many respects very worrying. But again, we'll see. The second point is that Israel discovered to its cost that when it withdrew from Gaza, all the settlements, all the settlers, when it withdrew even from the border between Gaza and Egypt, what it got was a different form of insecurity. And you can say, well, you know, only so many Israelis have been killed by Hamas's rockets. You know, if you look at the objective calculus, the Israelis seem hysterical. But if you happen to live in Ashdod or Ashkelon, 10 miles from Gaza, and you live with this constant sense that a rocket is going to land in your window, the idea that statistically the chances that it's going to kill you is perhaps not huge is not a great comfort. So I think Israelis, at least the emotional sense, is that the risks have never been greater. And also, there is, beyond that pressing sense that there is the expectation that Israel will now withdraw from large areas of the West Bank, and it will face the same kind of drizzle of rocket fire, mortars, terror, all the rest of it, that it faces now from Gaza. The larger question, though, obviously looming over everything, is the possibility of the Iranians developing a nuclear weapons capability, and from there having a nuclear arms race in the Middle East, where a number of regimes, none of which is particularly friendly to the cause of Zev Jabotinsky and Menachem Begin, will become nuclear weapon states. And I think that is the deep source of the deep sense of Israeli insecurity.
So that will brings me to one of the questions here. What do you think there will be a deal with Iran? What do you think should be done? Somebody says.
Well, I wrote a column in May saying Iran doesn't want a deal. And then in June or early July, it was extended for 5 months, and now, as everyone here knows, it was extended for 7 months again. And I hold that view. I don't think the Iranians are prepared to accept any kind of agreement that will meaningfully keep them from having a viable breakout path that the Israelis certainly can't live with. Well, maybe they can, but the Israelis say they can't live with, and the United States believes it can't live with. I think what will happen is I think both sides will actually kick the can down the road all the way up until January 21st, 2017, and the Obama administration can walk out of office saying...
So really, those many extensions?
I suspect
that's a lot, right?
Well, yes. I mean, I suspect something like that will happen. But, you know, events, dear boy, events, as someone once said.
Harold Macmillan.
Harold Macmillan, underappreciated British Prime Minister. Pity about Profumo and all that business. But things happen.
I think we're getting a sense of the average age of the audience, if you remember Profumo.
Things happen, and this is a real worry. I have a chapter in my book in which I brought out my inner Tom Clancy. This is chapter 9 of the book, because once you've written 8 chapters, you're so bored with yourself that you want to like rev up the engine. And so I imagine the world in 2019. And one of the scenarios I envision is that Iran may not be the first country to introduce or to test a nuclear weapon in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia might. And the Saudis have been talking very openly about this Pakistani option, the fact that they have some share, so they claim, or so some of them claim, of the Pakistani nuclear arsenal. Are we really comfortable with Saudi Arabia with nuclear weapons? What about Turkey? What about Iran? You know, Iran, people forget, Iran is a multi-sectarian state. Iran is as prone to the kind of ethnic implosion that we're now witnessing in Syria. What if an Iran with nuclear weapons has a Syria-like meltdown and the regime has these nuclear weapons? What happens to them? That's a very unpleasant scenario.
So there's a question here that I'm going to pass over just because I think I'm going to answer it myself, if you don't mind. Do you think the president is incompetent in foreign affairs? I think Bret's answer is yes. Let me ask you about, just to save, in the interest of speed. Let me ask you about the big issue that has erupted in Israel recently with this proposed law that the cabinet has proposed to add to the building Israeli constitution the idea that Israel should be explicitly described as a nation state for Jews.
I guess I'd make 2 points. First of all, it shouldn't be as controversial as it is, but the Israelis shouldn't do it. And I think vivid evidence of it was given by the fact that the hero in the recent horrific attack on that Jerusalem synagogue was a Druze police officer. And Israel can't afford to let those Druze police officers or its Arab citizens feel like they don't count in the society. And I think that would be the effect of that law. I mean, look, Israel has a lot of work to do internally. I mean, this is a country that is 67, 68 years old, depending on where you count. Where were we at age 68? We were in the, early 1840s. A lot of tribulation ahead of us. And there are some basic core issues that the Israelis haven't been able to figure out. Obviously, the most pressing one is the question about the Palestinians. And just to underscore this point, I am in favor of a two-state solution. I've always been in favor of a two-state solution. I just want to make sure the state on the other side of the line is a state that Israel and the international community wants to live with, that it's going to be a peaceful and good state for its own citizens and a responsible member of its neighborhood. And if that's the state, where do I care where the line is drawn? That's not what's at issue. But there's a question about repairing Palestinian political culture. There's a question about repairing internal Israeli political culture. I mean, I've never been a big fan of the settlements. Not because I think that the settlements are the end-all and be-all of the conflict, but because I think the construction of settlements encourages a mindset of lawlessness and messianism in the state, which is not healthy for it. So obviously, I don't. It's no secret that I am a big. I'm very much in the pro-Israel camp, if you would. But Israel has a lot of mending to do, like all countries, like all democracies. And one of the things that gives me confidence about the state is that it is a state that is having a constant argument with itself. I wrote this book so that we could have an argument with ourselves, right? The kind of conversation that Fareed and I are having, whatever our differences, the nature of this conversation, having it in the audience that we're having it, is one of the reasons why I'm so optimistic about the United States. I'm sorry to retreat into plugs for my book, but it's a temptation I can't resist. I called it American Retreat. I did not call it America in Decline. America is not in decline. America is going to be the most powerful country and the most prosperous country in the world for the rest of this century. That's my 2 cents. But let me tell you why it's happening, okay? It's happening because the conversations that we have and the conversations that you have are not taboo. They are productive. They are encouraged. We are thinking and arguing all the time. And open societies that focus on their problems are adaptable societies. Closed societies that show you their strengths but hide their weaknesses are not adaptable societies, they're brittle societies. So in the long term, Iran is in deep trouble, and China is in deep trouble, and all these fanatical regimes are in deep trouble because you can't have this kind of conversation on a stage and say things that someone might take offense to and we'd be hauled off and put into a Wien prison.
I think I just heard a vigorous defense of the Senate committee's torture report examining the CIA and asking it to justify itself in open debate, not in a closed, trust me, we did it very well scenario. And I actually feel very much that one of the great strengths of American government is that it's always examining itself and always asking whether it's doing the right thing. But I want to get back to Israel and ask you this. The vision you present with regard to the two-state solution doesn't seem likely. I mean, the parties that seem to be gaining ground, even in this precursor to the next election, are the ones that are even to the right of Bibi on this issue, like Naftali Bennett. So imagine 10 years down the road, there is no two-state solution. You're in the same situation, except that maybe it's 3 million Palestinians who are being ruled by Israel or under Israeli jurisdiction without without political rights. What if there arose among the Palestinian community a leader who said, forget the two-state solution, we just want the right to vote. We just want to be treated just like anybody else who lives under your sovereignty. What do you think would likely happen?
Well, I mean, look, that would be, let's imagine that this leader would then say, we want, well, that you would grant the Palestinians a state, obviously. Not because, well, because if you're willing to say, I mean, that would be indicative of
That's always been my advice to the Palestinians. Ask for one state and you'll get two. But they can't bring
Well,
themselves
I
to
imagine
do
a scenario in this book. What if there were a peaceful intifada? What if there were? What if Palestinians simply marched through the streets of East Jerusalemites marched quietly and peacefully through the streets of West Jerusalem, holding keys, an indication of the right, a kind of a token of the right of return. That would be very difficult for Israel because Israel's real Achilles heel is its susceptibility to moral reproach. And so in a sense, the Israelis have been the beneficiaries, or a certain strain of Israel has benefited from the enemies that it has had, who make themselves so detestable and so odious by their behavior that it's very easy for an Israeli consensus to emerge against them. Look, I think Israel and I think the international community should be working in some sedulous way towards creating the conditions in which a responsible Palestinian state can emerge. And we have seen instances, and they are rare, but they are real, of countries or people or nations that undergo fundamental political, cultural transformations. Germany after 1945, Japan as well. How is it that we create a political culture among the Palestinians that says, why don't you be, instead of like Yemen, be like Dubai? Why can't Gaza be Dubai, right? Why is it that your engineers have to be building rockets and not buildings or tunnels? And those are the kind of political conditions that we ought to be encouraging. It's not easy to do when the focus is simply on declaring the legal fact of statehood or supporting new or thinking about new intifadas or new wars, instead of creating ripe conditions for economic development and political maturation, or whatever you want to call it.
So put aside what you would like to happen. 15 years from now, will there be a Palestinian state, or what will Israel look like?
Look, as the saying goes, Niels Bohr said, prediction is very difficult, especially about the future, which is a genius.
I thought it was Yogi Berra.
Well, no, it was Niels Bohr. It's a brilliant line. Well, it's brilliant because when you think about it, the joke is that under socialism, the past can never be predicted. So look, I don't know. That's a real scenario that you'd have to imagine. 25 years ago, when I spent my first summer on a kibbutz as a teenager, it was next to impossible to make a phone call out of Israel. People forget this. Everyone's like, oh, Silicon Wadi, startup nation, most technologically sophisticated people in the world. It was such a backwater in so many ways back then. And who would have imagined that Israel would now emerge as a country with I think, more NASDAQ-listed companies than any other except for the United States. 25 years ago, you couldn't have imagined the Oslo peace process. 20 years ago, you couldn't have imagined the collapse of the Oslo peace process. The problem, I think, with most of the discussion about Israel is in a sense, your question is wrong. Most of the discussion of Israel 10, 15, 20 years ago, imagine X number of scenarios, who knows what's going to happen. But the reality and perhaps the tragedy of Israeli political life is that they have to spend their time thinking about what's in front of their nose, dealing with urgent questions, managing a political situation that's kind of like diabetes. It's a constant crisis or a constant problem that you have to face. And that is a worrisome thought. On the other hand, the country has actually managed to thrive, and as you were describing earlier, in 67 years become one of the most powerful and secure and prosperous countries in the region. So, like as in life, sometimes the future takes care of itself, and you deal with what you have to deal with this tomorrow and next week.
All right, let me ask you a final couple of personal questions, because I think it'd be interesting for the audience. If you weren't doing this, what would you be doing? What were your fantasies? What are your fantasies about what you'd like to do professionally? Keep it to professional.
Well, obviously the answer is spend more time with my wife and family. And by the way, I would like to point out that my children have returned, all right?
Furious text message, get back in here.
You know what? So my wife, okay, let me talk about my wife. My wife is one of these people who's extraordinarily talented in so many ways, right? Musically gifted, gifted as a writer. You can read her as a music critic in the New York Times many days of the week. Linguistically gifted. She's a PhD scholar from Cambridge. And I always felt sorry for her because she had so many options, so many roads that she plausibly could have marched down and had done successfully. I was kind of only good at this one thing. And I wake up and I think, oh my goodness, the one thing that I was good at, I managed to make a career of. I mean, there is this other side of me that it's an interior decorator manqué. But probably there are a couple of friends of mine in the audience who would say it's a good thing that I didn't happen to go down that particular road. And what's nice about my life is, and I think you must feel the same way, to have one foot in the life of the mind and one foot in the life of action. To think, but also to influence. To write, but also to travel. That's a wonderful thing to have. And so, people say, well, what do you want to do next? And I want to do nothing next. I want to write my last column, hopefully very far into the future, and plots.
On that seems like a wonderful note to end on. Bret?